We are very, very honored to have an amazing individual, Steve Deangelo, with us this morning. I just have to take a moment here and show you. This is a bio that I was given. It is 2 pages. Okay, I would be using up all of his speaker time if I read this off. So I am going to shorten it just a bit, but I think by the end of our time together, you will have really gained an understanding of who this gentleman is and what he has done for the cannabis industry. Steve Deangelo is a globally recognized cannabis thought leader. He is a speaker, an expert in the field. He was dubbed the father of the legal cannabis industry by former mayor of San Francisco and Speaker of the California Assembly, Willie Brown. In addition to that, he has been a lifelong activist. He's an author, he's an entrepreneur, he's an educator. His business achievements: he was co-founder of Harborside, which is one of the first 6 dispensaries located in the United States. In addition to that, he is part of the ArcView Group, which was the first dedicated cannabis angel investment group. He is also founder of Steep Hills Lab, which was the first testing facility. So you're hearing first, right? Most recently, Steve has transitioned to his passion project, which is absolutely amazing. It's called the Last Prisoner Project. And as a result of his work, there have already been several prisoners that have been released who were serving life sentences. Yeah, I know, I get the chills, yeah. Steve has also played a key role in the passage of Initiative 59, which is Washington, D.C.'s medical cannabis law. Also, he has been instrumental in the passage of Prop 64, which is California's adult use marijuana law. He was named one of the 7 most powerful people in the industry by Fortune magazine. You're going to have to come to next year's conference to find out who the other 1 through 6 were, okay? He was also honored by the Peter Tosh Equal Rights Award, and he became one of the first 2 inductees into the Marijuana Business Daily Hall of Fame, which you might not have even known that existed. So Steve's going to present on the impact of the war on drugs, the social equity, and economic impact of the cannabis industry. Steve.
Thanks so much, Audrey, for the kind introduction. The really short story is that I fell in love with cannabis at a very young age and grew up in a civil rights family, so standing up for what was right came very naturally to me. And so I became a cannabis activist, not wanting to spend the rest of my life as a cannabis criminal. I'll just fill in a little bit on the bio before we start getting into my brother's presentation. So by way of introduction to today's session, you were originally scheduled to have my brother Andrew present to you on the economic impact of the industry following my presentation. Unfortunately, he's been stricken with COVID. He cannot safely come into this room without infecting all of you. And so he's going to stay at home, and I'm going to do my best to work through his presentation and his slides and hopefully at least give you the main points that he wanted to make. I will caution you that I didn't have a lot of time to familiarize myself with this, so it may be a little bit of a magical musical mystery tour for a little bit of this. So just a little bit about me before we get started into that. Following my brother's presentation, I'll go directly into my presentation on social equity, incarceration, war on drugs, vision for the future. You'll get a bunch of big ideas in there, and hopefully we get through all of that in the first 45 minutes, take a break for you to consider and come up with some very insightful questions, and then I'll be here for another 45 minutes to answer those questions, and I'll stay on through the mixer. So hopefully none of you will leave today without having all of your questions answered. Please feel free to come up to me as frequently and as much as you'd like to do that. So I grew up, and my brother Andrew grew up in a middle-class family. Our father was a first-generation Italian immigrant he was first generation from an Italian immigrant family, first in the family to go to college, came to Washington, D.C. as a young man, recruited by the Kennedy administration to be part of the best and the brightest. And we had a nice middle-class upbringing, but that upbringing was punctured by some family trauma, by a death of a child, by a resulting divorce, and the family basically disintegrated. And so when I was in my later high school years and community college years, at least by a typical trajectory, I was in a kind of wounded place, and I was wandering a little bit trying to find a foothold. And that's when I found Montgomery County Community College. And the great thing about the community college experience for me was that they took me as I was, which was wounded, which was a little bit lost. My writing skills were nowhere where they needed to be. But they accepted me and they welcomed me, and I didn't have imposter syndrome. I didn't feel like I was someplace where I didn't belong. And so it gave me that handhold and enabled me to build confidence. Some years later, I was able to go to the University of Maryland, where I maintained an almost perfect 4.0 grade point average. And I credit a lot of that to my community college experience and the patience and gentleness and really love with which I was treated at that school. Subsequently, I've spent about 50 years in cannabis, done just about everything that you can do with the plant. About 20 years of that was spent in the legacy underground market. We'll talk about what that means a little bit more. About 20 years was spent in the legal market, and you've heard a little bit of those accomplishments. And there's 10 years that are kind of wobblers in there, sort of gray market. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. I've been arrested, I've been incarcerated. I spent a number of years battling with the federal government. Did not know when I went to work in the morning whether I was coming home at night or whether I'd be carried out in chains to a federal prison, along with everybody else who worked at Harborside. And it was a time when really we fought for our lives here and for the existence of the industry in California. So a little bit more of what qualifies me to speak on some of these subjects was the experience at Harborside, which was intended to provide a gold model standard for cannabis retailing, to prove to the world that it could be done in a way that brings benefits to communities rather than harms. And part of that, especially given the community ethic in Oakland, was hiring from the community and making sure that our staff came from that community, could engage with that community, and that we could help uplift the community. And so I had experience of really working with a lot of entry-level, working-class young people who were looking for their first jobs or maybe their second or third jobs. We hired people who had been working as dishwashers. We hired people who had been working selling cell phones. We hired people who hadn't been working at all for some period of time, and brought them into Harborside. And it gave me an opportunity to become familiar with their life circumstances, working with them over the course of almost 15 years. And, you know, I came away just so totally impressed with the cohort of young people that we have today. And many of them were seriously challenged. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But overall, I think that the generation of human beings that is alive today and the generations coming behind, they're the smartest generations of human beings that have ever been, right? They grew up with these keyboards in their hands, and they have this unparalleled ability to seek out new information and synthesize it into new ideas and share it and take action and make change happen. Smartest generation. I am so happy to be able to speak to them through all of you. So, okay. So my brother is going to be talking about, and I'll be channeling Andrew here. Andrew is much wittier and funnier than me, so my apologies to my brother in advance. How do sales in California compare to other states? Look, the basic story, as you can see here, look at all those little lines down at the bottom, and then that one great big line at the top, that's California. Okay, so California dwarfs every other legal cannabis market in the world. Now, this is despite the fact that the legal cannabis market in California is horribly broken and has only succeeded in capturing, at best, 20% of the overall economic activity driven by cannabis in the state thus far. And we're all the way up here. Two-year sales in California, again, despite the fact that in many, many months, we have actually seen outflows from the legal market, drops in the legal market. Overall, the legal market is still growing in California. Again, it's just a sign of how robust cannabis culture is in California, how mature it is, how many people in this state consume cannabis, how much a part of accepted life it is. Similar kind of curve in Oregon. Here's Michigan. So what's different about Michigan? I think that unlike Oregon and California, which have very, very deeply entrenched cannabis undergrounds, huge numbers of growers who are producing cannabis, in Michigan, that didn't exist. And in Michigan, they were used to getting pretty crappy weed, often Mexican weed, often paying very high prices. They were at the far northern tier of the country. And they didn't have a very robust legacy cannabis industry. We'll talk about that in a minute. And so the legal industry just soared, right? It grew much, much more rapidly. So now the interesting thing about legal cannabis, and one of the things that I think is a factor in continuing to drive the growth of the legal market in California, is that you can get all sorts of products that typically have not been available in the legacy or unregulated marketplace. And you can see all of these in here. I think that the important thing to look at is that 40% number for cannabis flowers, right? That number, when I opened Harborside in 2006, was 90%. And so you've seen this massive expansion of other market categories, of other products. And it's a reflection of the potential of cannabis. And I'm going to talk about the blank slate of cannabis a little bit later, but there is just so many things to be invented, to be explored, to be developed in this industry, and really this is just the beginning of them. And there have been some surprises in here, and there's been some fluctuations back and forth, but this is, I think, the main takeaway, right, is that what used to be an almost all flower market is now dominated by product types that are not just pure raw cannabis flowers. And that's really been enabled by the legal market. And I think that it speaks to the range of career opportunities that are going to be available for all of your students. Not just growers, not just retailers, but all of these other things. People who are going to make vape pens, people who are going to extract the cannabis, people who are going to create the capsules and new forms of concentrates. Again, I think this is just another illustration of the same thing here, right? That you see, really, even though flowers by overall absolute category are their largest product category now, they are shrinking as an overall share of the pie. Vape pen sales, you can see number 2, and this is, vape pens didn't exist. When we opened Harborside, there was no such thing as a vape pen, and now they're the number 2 product category. And I'll tell you something, as a cannabis consumer, most of them are horrible. They're really not very good. And so there's a huge a range of opportunity to improve these things moving forward. And California should be the place that does that, since we really kicked this whole thing off, right? Pre-rolls, kind of a simple thing, but again, it's a category that almost didn't exist. When we opened Harborside, if we wanted pre-rolls, right, we had to hire a bunch of old hippies or young hippies or somebody like that to sit there and roll joints by hand. Well, now there's these huge machines, there's automation, people are feeding weed in at one end of the machine, at the other end of the machine, the joints are rolling out. It's a whole new world. And it turns out that actually, even people who roll joints really, really well generally don't want to roll as many joints as they consume in a day. Edibles. This is kind of surprising. Edibles are at 10.8%. And I really expected edibles and beverages to consume a larger share of the market, given the legitimate health concerns about smoking cannabis, and given the stigma that's associated with the smell, with the smoke, with the visibility. I would have thought that there would be greater uptake in edibles. And I think that the reason that hasn't happened, again, is just because the product category hasn't been fully developed yet. Right now, cannabis edibles, most of them take about 40 minutes to hit you. And then they last for about 6 hours, right? And the same thing with cannabis beverages. So people who are used to drinking a beer and feeling it in 10 minutes will eat a chocolate or drink a cannabis beverage, and when nothing happens in 10 minutes, they eat another one. And when nothing happens in 10 minutes, they eat another one, right? And then not good things happen, right? So there are a lot of very smart people who are working on shortening that onset window and shortening that offset window so that people will be able to experience cannabis in more of the kind of way that they experience a drink. You feel it in 10 minutes, you feel it for a couple hours, it starts wearing off. You can titrate your experience more effectively. So, again, opportunities, lots and lots of opportunities out there. A blank slate. Concentrate sales, again, they seem to be, they're going down, right? Am I reading that right? Yes, concentrate sales are going down. I'll tell you why. This has to do with the dysfunctionality of the California market. Concentrate sales are not going down. They're actually booming. But nobody buys concentrates in legal dispensaries in California because there's a 40 to 50% tax rate in legal dispensaries in California, and concentrates by weight are very expensive. Maybe $50 to $100 a gram, $3,000 an ounce, right? So when you got a 50% tax on there, it hurts. So extract consumers, they're not in the dispensaries anymore. There's a lot of people who aren't in the dispensaries anymore. Beverage sales, again, it's like, why do we not have more than 1% cannabis beverage sales? I think it's what I talked about before. I think we'll get there. I think one day, 20 or 30 years from now, you may see that beverage category being larger than the flower or the vape pen category. Okay, again, so we're talking now about the mix by generations, and I'm sorry, brother, I love you, but this one's just a little bit beyond me to figure out. I will let you all look at that for a moment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we'll move on. This one I understand perfectly because it's one of the reasons that I say that the legal system in California is horribly broken. 2/3 of the state has no legal retail. Let me repeat that. In a state which legalized cannabis by a majority vote of its voters 5 years ago, 2/3 of our state still has no legal retail access to cannabis. Right? This has devastating consequences. Has devastating consequences on legal employment. It has devastating consequences on tax revenue. It exposes people to untested, potentially unsafe cannabis that they're consuming outside the dispensaries because, man, if you live here, what? You're not going there or here. You're calling up the local underground delivery service, which is there and is ready to serve you. Really, really distressing situation. This was a compromise that was made in Prop 64. It was a compromise that I argued against. Unfortunately, we didn't win that particular battle, and so localities were given an opt-out provision. If they did not want to legalize cannabis, they didn't have to, even though a majority of the voters in the state believe that we should. Okay, so this again, we're talking about I think he got this a little bit mixed up here, but the basic point here is that the underground unlicensed market in California is vastly larger than the regulated market in California, than the legal market in California. And way more people are being employed in the informal market with no worker protections, with no health protections, with no retirement programs, with no health insurance, and are still subject to being arrested. Right? And guess who gets arrested mostly? Okay, that's the end of my brothers. We're not going on a break yet. How are we doing on time? Perfect, because I'll be a little bit longer on this stuff than my brother's stuff. Okay, so we're going to preface my talk with a little conversation about language, because I think language defines the way that we think and the words that we use, and having a common understanding about them before we embark on this journey is really important. So the first thing is the war on drugs. The war on drugs, from my point of view, and I'll be using the term in this way, was a paramilitary campaign that was unleashed mostly on communities of color. Its historical precedents go way, way, way back, but in its modern incarnation, it started when the Reagan administration came into power, and it kicked off in the 1980s. A bunch of horrible laws were passed. Those laws went into effect in the 1990s and in the aughts, and they were a major, major driver of mass incarceration. What few people recognize is that cannabis arrests during these years amount to a larger number than all other drug arrests combined. For all other violent crimes combined, it has been a massive driver. Social equity. Social equity is a term that was coined by a white guy, a scholar in the Midwest of the United States. But really what it means to me is we're talking about restorative justice for the communities and the individuals, mostly communities of color, that were disproportionately impacted by this war on drugs, which was, the disproportionate impact was not just an unfortunate, unforeseen consequence. It was the motivating factor. So then we have social equity licenses. Social equity licenses were pioneered in Oakland, and they're basically license preferences that are designed to ensure some measure of restorative justice as we build this legal industry, that individuals who come from disproportionately impacted backgrounds and experiences have some shot at getting into the legal industry. And then there's legacy, which is the last term I'll define for you, which basically means the pre-existing cannabis market, the people that carried this plant through Prohibition, through those dark years. In California and the West Coast, I think that includes people who are in the medical cannabis world, where, from 1996 to 2016, basically are in constant warfare with the federal government here in this state, just to establish what we have today. So legacy and social equity overlap sometimes, but they're not the same thing. When we think about social equity candidates for social equity licenses, we're talking exclusively about people who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. When we talk about legacy, or when I talk about legacy, I'm talking about people who carried the plant through Prohibition. They could be white, they could be black, they could be Asian, they could be any race. But in general, it's the black and brown communities that were disproportionately impacted. So legacy contains probably, a very large number of social equity folks, but not entirely, and they shouldn't be confused as being the same thing. So impact, what's the impact of this war been on your students? Well, many of them are going to have criminal records for the possession and in some cases for the sales of cannabis. And those criminal records, unless they're expunged, unfortunately there are expungement provisions in many states today, will haunt them for the rest of their lives. They could prevent them from getting professional licenses, from being insured, from getting a mortgage, from getting health insurance, from a whole variety. They could just not have business deals offered to them because somebody found out about that when they were doing due diligence. So it's a real, real problem. And I encourage you, in California, we do have expungement legislation. It has not been effectively implemented by the state. It takes a push by the person who wants their record expunged. Please encourage all of your students who have cannabis records to get them expunged as soon as they can. They will have lived, many of them, in heavily impacted communities, meaning that they're used to getting jacked up on the street. They view the police, they view authority figures with a great deal of suspicion. They're suffering from post-traumatic stress. They will have had family members who have been addicted, because of war on drug policies, which really promoted hard drug use, or have been incarcerated because of war on drug policies, with devastating consequences. I mean, we know now that trauma like that introduces an intergenerational pattern to families. It takes generations and generations to recover. Again, I don't think that that's unintentional. Many will have had family members arrested. Many have been arrested and incarcerated. Many are going to still be participating in the legacy market, right? Many of your students are going to be people who are selling weed or growing weed and are paying their tuition and their living expenses to be able to be in school that way. And remember that this racially disparate enforcement continues. It's something that's important that all of your students know about. Black people are 3 times still more likely to be arrested on cannabis charges everywhere in this country than white people are. So if you have black and brown students, it's important that they know the realities and they know the risks that they're facing. And of course, everybody who enters the industry, everybody, until things change, is a felon under federal law. Cannabis is still a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law with no accepted legal use whatsoever. Anybody who works to provide it to somebody else is a felon under federal law. Me, personally, I actually qualify for, I don't know how many federal death sentences, because you can be put to death still in this country for constructive or actual possession of 60,000 or more cannabis plants, and my plants number in the millions. Let me give you a very short history of the California cannabis market and its roots and why California grew into such a powerhouse. How are we doing on time? Okay, good. So what happened is we all know about the Summer of Love and the growth of hippie culture in California and the introduction of cannabis to the middle class and all of that happened. Well, towards the end of the 60s and early 70s, a lot of hippies who were living in the cities decided that they wanted to move to the country and live in a different way and grow organic food and homeschool their children and start finding their way to a different kind of lifestyle that was more in keeping with their values. And many of those folks moved up to Northern California. They weren't growing there to become weed growers or to create a new industry. They were going there to find a new way of life, to be able to disengage from the larger commercial corporate world. But it turned out that they were really good at growing weed because they really loved it. So they put a lot of time and attention into it. And it turned out that that climate up there in Northern California, in some places anyhow, is just about perfect for growing really, really good cannabis. And then what happens is this sort of homegrown industry is happening up there where people are growing their own weed. They're trading it around a little bit. There might be a few sales going on down to San Francisco, but nothing big. Until the drug war policies that were directed at countries like Jamaica and Mexico and Colombia cut off the supply of cannabis from those countries. And nobody could get any weed. I was a weed dealer and I was traveling all over the country. I was going to every border that I could, and nobody could get the weed in. I'd go to the Mexican border. Nobody had any weed. I talked to my friends in Miami who were bringing in Colombian weed. Nobody could do it anymore. Jamaica was closed down. So people like me went to the Emerald Triangle and looked up our friends who had moved up to the hills all of those years ago and were explained the situation. And so, being good-minded hippies and knowing that the world needed cannabis, folks started expanding their gardens and growing a little bit more. And that was kind of nice because that weed that was going to the cities could also help them buy some property, build some houses, send their kids to school, and not be mired in the rural poverty that affects so much of the rest of rural America. And then it was really the intensification of the drug war that turned the Emerald Triangle into this boom area, this place that started producing the very best cannabis in the world at massive, massive quantities. And you started getting other folks coming into the Triangle who were motivated mainly by the money that they saw being made. And things have shifted and changed up there. But it's important to remember that the people who created that economy, which was a beautiful economy that worked very, very well, didn't do it out of greed. They did it out of love. So let's fast forward to 1996 and the passage of Prop 215 in California. And just think about between 1996 and 2016, there's basically constant federal attack on legal cannabis in California. As soon as we passed medical cannabis, the 4 U.S. attorneys, we had 4 prior U.S. attorneys who called a press conference. Do you remember what they called cannabis? Cannabis medicine? Cheech and Chong medicine. That's what they said medical cannabis was. I mean, can you imagine it now? It seems absurd with everything that we know about medical cannabis and how effective it is. But we had 4 previous U.S. Attorney Generals of the United States fly out to California to try and spike our legislation before we even got it off the ground. They urged the legislature to pass legislation to stop us from implementing the law. And they were actually pretty successful in doing that. The California legislature did not regulate cannabis in this state for almost 20 years because of the political pressure against regulating it. That's why Oakland became the first jurisdiction in the United States of America to regulate cannabis instead of the state of California. Thank you, Oakland. So the point to make here is that there's been a lot of negative messaging, a lot of stigma around cannabis that's been poured out by the federal government, by the clash with the federal government in this state. And that historic level of stigma, of misinformation, of disinformation about cannabis has really affected our regulatory program here in California. The birth of legal cannabis, where people are more comfortable with cannabis anywhere else, regulates cannabis more strictly than we regulate nuclear waste. You know about the seed-to-sale tracking system? Right? Okay, some of you do, but some of you don't, so I'll tell you. The seed-to-sale tracking system requires a cannabis company to track the cannabis from the time the seed is placed into the ground through each individual plant. A little tag has to be put on each individual plant. The plant has to be entered into a computer system. When that plant is harvested, you have to enter into the computer system who harvested, how they harvested it, when they harvested it, where it went to, what it was used for, and all of those checks have to be replicated all the way down the supply chain through manufacturers, through distributors, through retailers. Can you imagine the cost and the hassle that's involved in that? I don't know whether it's 10% of the price of a bag of weed or 15% of the price of it. It's big, okay? Now, why do we have the seed-to-sale tracking system? It's an archaic relic. It was instituted when we were trying to get medical cannabis accepted by the state, and there were 2 classes of individuals in California, those who legally could possess cannabis and those who could not. And so there was at least a rational argument to be made that you should not allow legal medical cannabis to be diverted into the hands of people who did not have the legal right to possess it. I don't agree with that argument, obviously, but it was at least arguably a rational argument, right? But now we live in a state where every single person, every adult in California has the legal right to possess cannabis. So who gives a damn if a few grams of weed drops out the bottom of the bucket that nobody knows about? It's just going into the hands of another adult, or if it's going into the hands of a kid, we have serious laws already in place to prevent that. So it's archaic. There's no reason to have seed-to-sale tracking, which is much more rigorous than the tracking we have on nuclear waste. When you're in an economy where every adult is allowed to possess cannabis, there's no reason to prevent diversion. So, and again, this map that we saw, right? That's driven by ignorance, it's driven by fear, it's driven by stigma, it's driven by 50 years of racialized cannabis enforcement. And then there's this other really heavy impact on California, which is the current federal ban on interstate commerce. 90% of the weed that's grown in California now and always has gone out of state to all the places that don't grow weed as well as we do. And yet under federal law, that's still illegal. And until we fix that, until we allow all of the people who are exporting California cannabis now to do so legally, right? we're going to have a strangled legal system in California. All the farmers who are so hurting right now because they are unable to sell their weed at a price greater than what it takes them to grow it would have a national market to access. Takeaway here, stigma strangles prosperity. Okay, quickly, let's work through incarceration. I already gave you a few of the figures around cannabis and incarceration. Those factors led to us having today in the United States 40,000 people who are in prison on cannabis convictions. Right? This is what led me to start the Last Prisoner Project, which I started in 2017. Thank you. And there's a lot of speeches talking to me about the origin story of the Last Prisoner Project. Google me, you can find them. It's a very poignant story, but I sort of had this moment that spoke to me and made me found that organization. And I'm happy to report that we have been successful in releasing people like Michael Thompson, who previously was the longest serving nonviolent prisoner in Michigan's state prison system. He did 25 years for selling 3 pounds of weed. I used to sell 5 times that much weed right down the street at Harborside every day. 25 years. Richard DeLisi, formerly the longest serving nonviolent criminal in the United States. Richard did 30 years. He did 30 years on a 90-year sentence. He had a little bit more weed than Michael did. He was bringing in tons of weed and flying it into Florida. But I don't think it really matters, right? What we know now is that cannabis never should have been illegal, right? And that regardless, there are people who thought that they were just doing it for the money, but I think that everybody who carried this plant through Prohibition and took the hits for it is a hero, because we wouldn't be here today without it. And all the people, all the children, all the elders, all the veterans, all the lives that are being saved, none of that would be happening without people like Richard DeLisi and Michael Thompson. It still goes on. We've got Kevin Allen in Angola prison in Louisiana, former plantation where 80% plus of the prisoners never leave. Kevin is doing life without parole. His crime, $20 sale of weed. A $20 sale of weed. It was his third strike. It was his third strike. So naturally, he deserves to go to prison for the rest of his life for selling $20 a week. Alan Russell in Mississippi. Again, a little bit more weed. 30 grams. He was pulled over in a traffic stop. Last year, the Mississippi Court of Appeals affirmed his life without parole sentence. So Kevin and Alan will die in prison if we don't do something to get them out. And that's why I started the Last Prisoner Project. lastprisonerproject.org if you want to learn more about it. I can't leave this subject without talking for a minute about President Biden, who, when he was running for president, made a big point in one of the debates to say that he thought that nobody should be in prison on cannabis charges and everybody should be allowed out. There's almost 10,000 federal cannabis prisoners. President Biden knows each and every one of their names because I made sure that he does. He's only released 5. So those of you who are active in the Democratic Party, please do what you can to send a message to the president that that's just not enough. It's just not enough. And then finally, the impact of the war on drugs on all of this stuff is that you will have many students who will also be on parole and probation, whose parole and probation requirements prevent them from working in the industry, require them to get drug tested, other sorts of stuff. We talked a little bit about social equity, and social equity, and now I'm really talking about social equity licensing preferences. I think they're a great thing. Oakland and San Francisco were the first to pioneer them. I think it's a necessary part of restorative justice. But they're blunt instruments. And one of the things that's happened is that licenses have been issued to folks and they have no way to financially develop those licenses. And so they end up in these very predatory relationships where investors who are much more sophisticated present them with a basically take it or leave it deal that includes a stack of documents, a shareholders agreement, an operating agreement, a job description, a financing agreement, all of which interact and are very complex. And they amount to trading the social equity licensee out of their license at the lowest price in the quickest period of time. So states have seen this happen, and more recently states that are regulating have changed it, Illinois and New York. Well, Illinois attempted to do a better job and really didn't do much of a job. They issued 20 licenses to social equity licensees, and there was an expose a couple weeks later in the Chicago Sun-Times that found that behind every one of those social equity licensees was a white-owned corporation. So it's a tricky thing. It's not easy to do, right? The licensing preferences are blunt instruments. They can be gamed. They can be played around. And since I'm running out of time now, I am going to suggest a slightly different route, right? I think that there's other ways of bringing about the restorative justice that's really critical. And I'm going to share these with you because I think that you could lobby for them. One of them is that we really need to think about community-based investment for our social equity licensees. There's a woman named April Arasate who has a dispensary called Core in Boston. April got 80% of her financing from the immediate surrounding neighborhoods, none in a larger quantity than $50,000. So she has an investor base of 83 folks from the community instead of an investor base of a bunch of rich guys from out of state. And they are giving her a lot more latitude to build an equitable business than anybody else would. We can also do things like have employment preferences and shelf space preferences. Rosemary Jane, a dispensary that just opened in Oakland, pledged to hire 50% formerly incarcerated people and pledged, I don't remember the number, but a significant amount of shelf space to other social equity owned brands. But what I'm really excited about is the idea that's being pioneered in New York right now of some innovative license types that I think are really more finely tailored to provide opportunity. One of them is a micro license category that allows people to grow a 5,000 square foot canopy, do anything they want with that cannabis, and then directly retail it to their end consumers. Doesn't take a lot of money, doesn't have a lot of bosses, you can do your own thing. It replicates the structure in the legacy market. It allows the grower to maximize their margin and the consumer to get a higher quality product at a lower price. Now imagine if we educated a cohort of students to be able to get those licenses and exercise those licenses, and then we built them a village where we could have 100 or 200 of those little craft cannabis producers all together, right? Where consumers could go and they would go from strain to strain, from a tea to a cigar to an infused candy, to all sorts of beautiful craft cannabis experiences where the consumers would get a better deal, where the producers would get a better deal, right? Who loses? Well, somebody up there in the pyramid, I don't know. I don't care about them either. Worker-owned co-ops, another way to go to take a look at. And I'm just going to close because I can see Amber getting nervous. What's your mission? You know, your mission is really, it's to make cannabis education more accessible. Right now it's bottled up in all of these private providers. Costs a lot of money. It's not easy to get to. So you are the front lines of taking that cannabis information to people who really need it, who can't afford to go through all of the hoops through the private educators. I'm not going to try and tell you how to do traditional workforce development. You're all the experts. You know how to do that really, really well. Study the industry, develop the curriculum. There's a huge need for this, right? It's a really worthy work for you and your students. Cannabis one day will be the largest, most valuable industry on the planet. Why? Set aside all of the medical, all of the spiritual, all of the quote-unquote recreational uses. Every time you harvest a hectare of cannabis hemp, you sequester 20 tons of atmospheric carbon. And that hemp can be used to make anything that you make out of petroleum or trees or cotton or a whole range of other extractive materials. So with hemp, a hemp economy properly developed, we can replace the extractive raw materials and simultaneously clean up the mess that they have made. That's why cannabis will be the world's largest industry in time. So don't miss anything, right? Look at it all, don't miss any sectors. Make sure that cannabis information is integrated into existing curricula as well as being offered in its own defined curricula. Cannabis is something that should be a part of almost every course, I think. Lobby for reasonable state and local regulations. Lobby for federal reform. And most of all, you know, cannabis is a blank slate. It's this industry, unlike any other industry. Most industries, they get decided in the back rooms. They get decided by the bankers before they even hit the people, right? We have an opportunity because of cannabis regulation, because of groups like yours, because of what's going on all across this country and all across the world to create a new industry that's not just a new industry, but it's a new kind of industry that has different kinds of economic structures that don't just feed our children into the existing corporate maw, but empower them and educate them to build regenerative economic structures that rebuild and restore our communities instead of further deplete them. Thank you all for your very good work.
Mr. Steve, don't go far, because we're going to keep this party going. Can we give him one more round of applause, please? Yeah. We try to read the room here. We know you just had lunch. Your stomach is probably a little heavy, so if everyone can just get up and stretch a little bit. When you are ready, you can sit back down when you're comfortable, but feel free to move around. If you need to use the restroom, do that. But we're going to keep this party going, and I know that all of you have many questions for Steve Deangelo. I know I have several, but one of you submitted a question via Mentimeter, so I'm going to kick us off with that question, Steve. And that question is, what can we do about social media shadow ban and other forms of cannabis censorship? What are your thoughts?
Well, I actually think that, you know, let's first be clear what the shadow ban is. Most social media platforms either explicitly will remove your account. So I've had an Instagram account, our Harborside Instagram account was shut down 6 or 7 times with tens of thousands of followers each time. They never gave us any of our followers back. No notice, no explanation. They didn't even tell us why it happened. The same thing has happened to many, many, many other cannabis companies. Even worse is they play with the algorithm and they set it up so that people can't find you, right? Where really you should be found because there's a lot of people looking for you, right? But they divert those looks, they divert those searches, they shadow ban you, they shut you off to some dark corner of the internet where nobody can find you. Why? Because they know, right? When there's a truthful, it's all coming from the federal government. Let's make no mistake here. The reason that all of the internet companies, all of these platforms are doing what they're doing is out of a slavish sense of obedience to federal cannabis policy. If you go into the legal department of any corporation in this country and you start talking about cannabis, you will instantly get all sorts of warnings about this, all sorts of warnings about that. And how does it end? I think that this is part of a larger issue that we've got going on where we have these very, very powerful communication platforms in our society that we, the people, don't have any control over, right? So I think we need to take a look at that larger question and make sure that not only can they not shadow ban cannabis conversation, but they can't shadow ban any of our conversations.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll float around the room to give all of you an opportunity to intervene as well. So one of the slides that you had earlier was about the middle of our state being red and the outside being blue, essentially prohibition still continuing on in some of those counties and cities. What can we do about that? Is there, you know, you said that was a compromise in the original proposition. what are some things that we can do to, you know, reverse that or to make some progress in that area?
Well, you know, I think that the legislature needs to take action here, right, and really needs to step in. And there are some legal questions about how far the legislature could go in terms of actually ordering local jurisdictions to implement licensing for cannabis. But they could certainly set up a very, very powerful set of incentives for them to do that, right? Financial incentives, if you do regulate, good things are going to happen to you. Financial disincentives, if you don't regulate, bad things are going to happen to you. Let's be real, this is having a serious, serious impact on tax revenue in the state of California. This is not an insignificant consequence. What is already the world's largest legal market for cannabis would be 3 or 4 times the size that it is if we captured all of it. Our tax revenues would be 3 or 4 times greater. What would you all do if your budget was 3 or 4 times greater? Be pretty nice, huh? It's possible.
Absolutely. Okay, questions from the audience. Any burning questions? Yes, awesome.
Hello, my name is Yesenia. So I have a question in regards to what your thoughts and opinions are now that New York has expanded their legalization, because I know personally of some people in the industry that for 420 they flew out specifically to go celebrate in New York. So that made me very curious on if California has this great of an influence, how is it going to trickle in there?
Well, you know, God, I've loved my years in California. They've been wonderful, wonderful years. They helped me bring my dreams true. I grew up on the East Coast, and, you know, this is the place that everything happened for me. But in the last year, I've spent more time in New York than I have in California. And the reason for that is that New York passed the most progressive cannabis legislation that's ever been passed anywhere. The hallmark of that is a 50% allocation for social equity licenses. But there's also these other really interesting things that are going on, like the micro license category that I talked to you about. It's kind of incredible that nobody's done that before, because it's sort of the way that all growers, most legacy underground growers, do business anyhow. It's a very natural thing to do. They also have licensing preferences for worker cooperatives, so it's not just going to be corporations that can get in, it can be some worker-owned cooperatives that get licenses as well. A lot of what's going on in New York right now, though, is a promise that we're going to need to work very, very hard to make sure that it gets fulfilled. I'll give you one example. To a great deal of fanfare, the Cannabis Control Board in New York announced that the first 100 cannabis retail licenses were going to be issued to previously incarcerated people. Did you see that story? So here's the definition of previously incarcerated, which turns out to be a misnomer. What they really meant was justice involved. It's not the word they used in their press release, but that's what they meant. And the justice involved definition is that you or an immediate family member have to have been convicted of a cannabis offense in the state of New York. That cannabis offense can be as simple as possession of 1 joint of cannabis if you've been convicted of it. You don't ever have to have done a day in jail, not part of the requirement. So there is another requirement, however, which is very difficult for people who actually have been in prison to meet. And that's that you are also able to show 2 years tax returns showing a 10% interest in a profitable legal business. So this is an insurmountable obstacle for many, many, many people who have been active in the legacy cannabis market. It means that a white lawyer who lives on Central Park West, who has a kid that got busted for possession of a nickel bag of weed, who has 25 different profitable businesses, easily qualifies, where my friends who have been selling weed for 25 years on the boulevard in New York, who have gone to prison for it, don't qualify because they don't file tax returns. They don't do that. They don't get close to that. So there's a lot of promise, and there's also a lot of slipping there, slippage that's already happened. And that's why I'm on the ground in New York, is to do my best to make sure that what's happened here in California is not repeated in New York.
Thank you. You touched on expungement, and I just wanted to point out a resource at the community college level. American River College is a college in our system that has an expungement clinic, and I know they do work to reverse cannabis convictions. And so it's kind of a lead into the next question that I have. So if you have students who need expungement, one, send them to American River College because there's a clinic there that can help them. Two, I want to get an idea of how you view the role of community colleges when it comes to training the future of the workforce. You touched on it briefly, but you have a room full of educators. They're pioneers in their own right, trying to meet the needs of the industry. Can you tell us a little bit more how some ways or some advice that you could give them when it comes to making an impact?
Sure. I think it's a little bit different with cannabis because of the different way that this industry is developing, right? So typically, you know, at least as I understand community colleges, there's a lot of workforce development. A lot of your mission is making sure that the industries that are growing in the areas in which you're located have sufficient educated, trained workforce, and by the same token, the people who are growing up in those areas have access to good careers and good jobs and future prosperity. Is that about the mission? Yeah, okay. So typically, then that would mean that you take a look at existing industries, you take a look at existing roles, and you figure out the optimal way to get your students prepared to play those roles. With cannabis, those roles are still in the process of being defined. And many of your students are going to have a unique opportunity not to be employees, but to be owners. Right? And even if they don't have the opportunity to be owners in the classic sense of the word, if we're able to expand the use of these innovative licensing types like worker cooperatives and micro licenses, then they may be able to have access to a different type of ownership. And so this is where I think that the great promise is and lies. Certainly, look, not everybody's an entrepreneur, right? But within your student classes, there are going to be people who are entrepreneurs, who would like to be entrepreneurs, who have just never really been given a real opportunity to do that. And now that opportunity can exist. So by all means, you know, do the traditional work of examining the roles in the industry and preparing people to take those roles. But I'd also love to see community college classes on these innovative license types, on figuring out business models that would help those innovative license types succeed. You know, in this country, we were supposed to have a restorative justice event for black and brown communities, for black communities, at the end of the Civil War. That never happened. You all know the story of Reconstruction and 40 Acres and a Mule. We have another opportunity now, you know, maybe the best opportunity that we've had since Reconstruction for an act of restorative economic justice. And so I would hope that you can reach beyond the traditional role and start preparing your students to move into roles that look more like ownership than roles that look more like employees.
Thank you for that. It inspired me to ask you a question about the value of cannabis education and how that ties into apprenticeship programs and unions. So what is your perspective on that as an advocate and a business owner?
Well, there's a number of different apprenticeship programs that people have talked about, and I'm not quite sure what you're referring to. So I will tell you that I come from a union family. I believe that a re-energizing of the union movement in this country is going to be necessary to maintaining democracy moving into the future. I am thrilled to see the development of things like the Amazon Workers Union. I would like to see a lot more of that. That's kind of the organizing model that I would prefer to see in the cannabis industry. What I've seen thus far is that unions who for years and years and years didn't care about cannabis, had nothing to do with cannabis, were not part of our struggle, were not part of our movement. In fact, often we're unions for people who were against us. As cannabis became legalized, started seeing us as an organizing opportunity. And some of the first union organizers that came in, I dealt with them personally. One of them was a guy named Dan Rush, who ended up doing, you know, a significant amount of time in prison because he was going around and basically, you know, offering business owners an opportunity to do a behind the deal, under the table deal to the disadvantage of the people that he was representing. And I don't want to paint the whole union movement with that brush. I don't think that that's real, but I would wish for a genuine workers movement coming out of the cannabis industry that looked more like the Amazon workers movement than cannabis people trying to fit into the existing unions. Apprenticeship programs. I think that just like anybody who's making a legal livelihood in cannabis has an obligation to make sure that people who are still in prison on cannabis charges gets out, we also, people like me who have done that, who have succeeded, have an obligation to mentor and to help other people along. And that can be done in an individual way, that can be done in a programmatic kind of way. It can be done through apprenticeships, it can be done through mentorships, it can be done through incubators. But, you know, I believe that cannabis teaches us certain lessons and certain values. And I like to think that we, cannabis people, are the kind of people who, when we get up to the top of the mountain after a long struggle, we don't cut the ropes so that nobody else can come up after us, right? We roll those ropes down and we make sure that everybody's climbing up behind us because we know there's a bunch more mountain ranges in front of us yet to go.
Hi, thank you. So I'm going to preface my question with just a little comment. So I agree with you that there's this like community college, workforce development, look what the industry wants. So as a proud former academic senate president and faculty member, right, we also mostly care about critical thinking in the community colleges and building just people who are thoughtful, go for their goals, and feel empowered to do that. And so I'll just put a plug out there that just going to college is probably a good piece of building up this entrepreneurial capability. And don't worry so much about the specific tasks. But my question does have to do with specific tasks. So I come at this from, I'm a biotechnology career education person. So I've been in this world a long time. What does the industry want? Let me teach the students these special tasks so the industry can have their robots, right? So I see some overlaps. And so I'm curious with your expertise, not just in California, but nationwide, about two pieces of the industry and how to help approach this with students. One is testing, right? The sampling of the product and testing and certificates of analysis and all that. And second, there's the seed to sale tracking. So that has never shocked me. I worked with radiation in the lab during my graduate school, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission could come at any, like, to me that doesn't faze me. Biopharmaceutical production, you do kind of the same thing, tracking all the inputs to all the pharma. So, and I know in this industry there's a lot of upset with the tracking system. So whether you love it or not, what's the realistic couple decades out across the country scene that students just need to be aware of, whether they love it or not? Does that make sense, my question?
I think so. Let me tackle it, and then feel free to guide me if the ship's running in the wrong direction. Just on the seed to sale, I would note a couple of things. First of all, radioactive waste kills people. Cannabis heals people. So there's a huge qualitative difference in the products. And while I think there's a good case to be made for very, very precise tracking of products that kill people, I don't think that you can make the same case for cannabis. The other is that what is the future? I think we're going to see the end of seed to sale. I think we're going to see interstate commerce. I think that that's going to happen in the not too distant future. The state of Oklahoma implemented their legal system without seed to sale. They still don't have seed to sale. They don't seem to be in any hurry to do that. The state of Oregon, the legislature has already passed a law authorizing the cannabis regulators in that state to export cannabis to other states that will allow the import of cannabis from Oregon. We have generations of young people now who are growing up who grew up with legal cannabis, who have never lived under prohibition, who feel the same kind of outrage that women are feeling now about this ridiculous Roe v. Wade thing that's going on. And so I think that there's no question that cannabis freedom is going to be expanding. I think we're in a momentary hiccup with the Biden administration. I think that Joe Biden's just a dyed-in-the-wool prohibitionist who really believes that cannabis should be illegal, and I don't think he's going to change his mind this late in his career, but he's not going to be around that much longer. And, you know, objectively, Donald Trump was better on cannabis policy than Joe Biden's been. I mean, he released a dozen cannabis prisoners on his last day in office. Biden's not anywhere close to that yet.
Other questions from you all? Yes, I have a question back here.
You covered a little bit of the advocacy that you've been doing over the years, but I know I've been following you and you've been active all the way up to, I saw you at the State House last week. What are the latest things you've been doing?
Well, you know, on the advocacy level, I'm really working to now ensure that, first of all, on the Last Prisoner project and continuing to move that project forward, I've learned that what I'm really good at is doing the new things that most folks aren't willing to tackle yet. And that if I'm really successful, a lot of people come behind to help support those visions, and that allows me to move on to the next one. And that sort of happened with the Last Prisoner project now, which is arguably the most well-funded organization in the cannabis advocacy world. And we've got 20 full-time employees who are, you know, busy executing on that mission. So I just launched a new nonprofit in October called the Justice Foundation. You won't find a website yet because we're still waiting for our 501c3 approval, and I don't want to advertise too much. But the mission of the Justice Foundation is to ensure that legacy cannabis operators have the opportunity to participate in the legal industry. One, because, well, three reasons. One, those are my peeps, it's where I come from, and it's just loyalty to my community. Two, it's the right thing to do. The legacy community sacrificed mightily over the course of decades in order to carry this plant through prohibition. We had our homes taken away, we had our children taken away, we were arrested, we were imprisoned, we had our lives ruined, in some cases people died, and thousands of us are walking around with incurable post-traumatic stress and will for the rest of our lives out of those experiences. So it's only right that the people who sacrificed to build the market get to enjoy it. But there's an overarching region. Thank you. My timing's a little off since COVID, you know, it's like, but this overarching reason is really, we're talking about legalization itself. Look at the situation that we've got in California today, where 80% of the market is not legal 5 years after we passed legalization. That can only be classified as a failure. It is a persistent dual market in which really today, I hate to be cruel to California, which has been so kind to me, but I have to tell you what I've been telling people around the rest of the country. In California, the only people that buy weed in legal dispensaries are tourists or people who are so stupid that they don't know how to buy weed from their next door neighbors at half the price on either side of them. It's this very difficult legacy. It's this very difficult situation in California. What was the question? I'm sorry, I got lost. Well, I'm carrying on. So we don't want that to happen in New York, right? So there's a few things that we're doing with the Justice Foundation in order to make sure that does not happen. One is just working on regulations and making sure that there's actually a proactive pathway to surface legacy operators, that it's not, you know, in California, honestly, when we legalized, the prevailing attitude among regulators was we got to get rid of these legacy people. They're criminals. They broke the law. We can't trust them. And even in New York, there's some of that attitude, right? But it's starting to change, and we need to make sure that the regulations actually proactively welcome legacy folks into the legal system. Any of you who are interested in me drilling down on the details, come see me afterwards. I have a whole program. It amounts to, before you license new corporate actors in any new cannabis market, you surface the already existing actors in the cannabis market, and you help them to become legal. You give them whatever support that they need to become legal. Because if you do not do that, if you try to bring a legal industry, a regulated and taxed industry in on top of them while they're still there, and you do not invite them in, they will stay outside and they will outcompete the legal industry, just as they've done in California, just as they will do in New York. So if you want legalization to fail, legacy has to go first. It's in everybody's interest. You may wait 18 months if you're an MSO or a big corporation to get into the market, but then you enter a market that's 3 or 4 times the size that it would be otherwise. It's in everybody's interest to do that. So 1, we work for regulations that make sure that legacy gets into the legal market. 2, we make sure that legacy operators have an opportunity to fill the skills gap that has been saddled on them by having to operate in the gray market. When advertising can be followed back to you and used to arrest you, or financial records can be used as evidence in a trial against you, you don't do those things. You don't learn those skills. You just don't learn them. You get very good at evading laws, but compliance is not one of the skill sets that you develop, right? So you have to make sure the legacy operators have the skills that they need to succeed. And 3, we need to make sure that once all of that is done, that new legacy operators going to the legal industry aren't subjected to the same kind of predatory practices that have been so prevalent in the social equity realm. And I think all of those things are possible. I actually think that the legacy community offers the biggest pool of sophisticated talent and subject matter experts that you can find in the world of cannabis, particularly here in California, and that the key to a successful industry moving forward is going to be building a single unified market that incorporates legacy.
All right, Steve, we have a question over here.
Hi, my name is Craig. I'm a dope dealer. Steve, thank you for your service. I also want to thank the educators. I'm a product of Diablo Valley College, year of 1980. Thank you for giving me a chance. So these policies seem to be run by elected officials, and is there a clearinghouse? It's a numbers game. How can we truly band together to elect, to be unified in who we elect and how we do it?
Well, up until recently, I would have to tell you that was not an option that was available in the world of cannabis activism, but there's now a new organization called the National Cannabis Party. You can look them up. And the whole point of the National Cannabis Party is to identify friendly candidates to support and to find unfriendly candidates to punish. They're just getting started. They are also unique in the, not unique, but not usual or typical in the cannabis advocacy world, in that they were founded by people of color, and most of the organization thus far is people of color. So I'm very excited about that work. I've thought that for a long time it's just absolutely crazy the way that politicians are taking cannabis voters for granted. If there was any other issue in which you had 69% of American voters agreeing on it, everybody would be on board with it, right? Everybody would be on board with it. 69% of people in America believe that cannabis should be legal. And the Senate keeps on blocking it. Joe Biden doesn't care about it. Are you kidding me? Would this happen with any other issue? No.
That's a great point. We have time for about 2 to 3 more questions. I know you all have burning questions for Steve. Who wants to go? Yes, awesome.
Thank you. Hi. So in our program, it's a free program and we provide it, but our main focus is to bring folks from 21 to 24. We'd like to expand that demographic at some point because we're funded by the city. Office of Workforce Development, but we want to bring re-entry into our program. The only thing that we have problems with is trying to assign them employment and apprenticeships, because they're still either expunging their records or they have violent crime stuff that are attached to those expungements, to those charges. So we're just kind of in this place where we don't know. We want to tell employers, yes, they're beautifully safe. They went through our program, and they're working on their expungement, but we don't want that to deter folks from not participating in the industry. And actually, we don't know what the stipulations are for companies to hire our reentry folks, basically.
Well, every company is going to be different, right? But what we've found at Last Prisoner Project with quote-unquote cannabis offenses is that people very rarely just get arrested on one charge. There's usually a list of charges. Those charges usually have cannabis as part of it, and then there's often other charges that are a part of it too. And sometimes those charges include possession of weapons or other allegations of some form of violence. For me, what's really important to remember is that people who have been operating in the legacy cannabis market have been operating without the protection of law. They have not had the ability to resolve business disputes in the courts. They have not had the ability to call the police if they've been robbed. They have not had the ability to go to mediators for mediation services. All of the normal conflict resolution mechanisms that you would see in a legal business have been denied to people in the legacy market. And so a lot of folks carried guns. Sometimes they had to use guns. It was a matter of survival for them. And I don't think that it's fair to judge people in that situation as being violent criminals, right? I think they're entrepreneurs and business people who are taking prudent and reasonable steps to protect themselves, and they shouldn't be punished for that. Now, getting that ideation across to an employer who's never lived in that reality, that's a whole other thing that's really difficult. And that's where I think it's about storytelling, right? You can quote the statistics. I can talk about 40,000. We can talk about recidivism. We can talk about that all day long. But I have, when I've sat in a room with a bunch of white investors who've never been behind bars in a day, and I put Michael Thompson in front of them, and Michael talks to them for 45 minutes, and he tells them what his story is, they come out with a more of a heart feeling around it than hours and hours of the statistics would give. And so I think that finding a way to surface our personal stories, both are the stories of tragedy, right? But there is so much talent in the social equity and in the legacy community. It's just not highlighted, and stories that just are not told. And my experience with the privileged part of the business community that's like so deep in implicit bias that they don't even know that they're there, is that still you can reach some of them if you hit them in a really, really personal level, and it's just finding a way to organize their personal interaction. So one of the things I'm doing with the Justice Foundation is reaching into my Rolodex of like all these fabulously successful guys in the industry who are kind of grateful to me for helping kick the thing off, who have said that they want to be in mentorship relationships. Well, now we're going to do that, right? Now we're going to do that. I've got a list of 300 people, and I've got a list of more than 600 mentees who need to be, we're going to make that work happen. And I think that it's, that unfortunately there's this, this kind of painstaking, long, slow, difficult work of different kinds of people introducing ourselves to each other. And we're in the beginning process of doing that. I think the cannabis industry offers a unique opportunity to do that.
Thank you. Last question. Who would like to ask it? One last question. I know we have a good one out there. No pressure. Yeah?
This isn't actually a question. It's more of an ironic situation. You mentioned guns. And, as an adult use customer, I can walk in to any dispensary and buy cannabis. If I were to get a medical card through the state of California, I am precluded from being able to own a handgun or a firearm. I'm not necessarily a gun person, but I think that's kind of a strange irony. What do you think about that?
Well, look, it's just, it's one of a whole range of unconstitutional actions that have been taken against cannabis consumers. And, this was done by right-wingers in the U.S. Congress who just take advantage of any opportunity that they have to attack the cannabis community and do mean things to us. And I think that it reflects it's really wild, right? Because it's the same people who are like, give everybody guns. Let's have guns everywhere. Let's have the teachers carry guns. Let's have open carry guns. Guns. But don't give the guns to the people who won't use them. Don't give the guns to the people who will think twice before they pull them. Oh no, we can't give the guns to those weed people. That would be really, really dangerous, right? It's absolutely bizarre. But unfortunately, it reflects a level of hatred that's present, and underneath that hatred is racism. So we can never forget that the guys that passed that legislation are also deep, deep racist. And when they were denying guns to weed people, they were denying guns to black and brown people.
Thank you. On that note, thank you, Mr. Steve Deangelo. Give him one more round of applause.